Welcome Giridhar Sanjeevi. Thank you for doing this. I want to be respectful of your time and harness this rich experience you have on the subject you and me both are very passionate about, corporate governance, particularly in the context of related party transactions.
Thanks, Bhupender.
Giri, wanted to get your thoughts on startups, right? We all talk about it. Some of them have become unicorns, and I'm sure it couldn't have been done with a right business model, but equally a right corporate governance model.
Yeah.
Do you agree, or you think the current requirement is over governance?
I think startups go through an interesting transition because ultimately the startup founders are working on a business idea, and there is a hustle culture for sure actually, and therefore there is an urgency in terms of driving up the business actually. And to be honest, I think up to the point where serious private equity doesn't come, I think governance is largely driven by entrepreneurs in their own way, and many of them may not have a background on governance actually. I think that is number one. When private equity kind of comes in, they also have their own oversight on governance because many of them do sit on boards actually, and so they do drive corporate governance. But the biggest transition arises when companies need to transition to becoming a public company, because the mindset shift is very, very critical actually. It's an extremely critical thing because no longer, in a strange way, I would say that while you are unlisted and you have private equity on the board, you have the cover of the private equity who are kind of tolerant in a way in terms of what happens actually. But the moment you become listed, I think you are completely unprotected actually, because you are absolutely out in the open. A very common problem that we have seen with listed companies, that is startup companies which have listed, is a simple thing like predictability of performance. So there have been cases where the information memorandums have talked about a certain level of performance actually, and then post listing there have been shockers in terms of performance where companies have kind of demonstrated significant losses, and we have seen examples where that has happened. There has been significant drop in market capitalization of say 40% in a single week as an example. So hence I think the mindset shift is what we need to worry about, and promoters need to remember that while the hustle culture certainly is important, I think, but equally the governance becomes extremely critical. In fact, on this point, I do want to say is India is kind of transitioning, because when you talk of governance from a Western perspective, we all talk with reference to blue chip corporations, which is all about sophisticated levels of governance actually. Whereas if you take Indian startups who are doing well, who are listed as well, there is a very strong hustle culture actually. The question is that how does the hustle culture ensure governance is probably the biggest challenge actually, and for not just the promoters but the independent directors on the board and everyone else. How do you make sure that the governance is protected while the hustle culture is not destroyed actually? I think that balance is very critical actually.
So this balancing act is the key, because you need growth, but growth, to make it sustainable, you need a right governance model, and the right mix would make you go longer and stronger.
Exactly.
I would agree. Giri, one more interesting fact is almost 60 to 70% of what trades between group companies.
Yeah.
Right. If I look at BSE and NSE together, mutually exclusive, 6,000 all listed. One data point I was reading, 70% of them is still promoter driven.
Yeah.
SEBI in the past made amendments that even a promoter exit, partial exit, maximum exit is done, he still would be termed as a related party.
Yeah.
Right. So the role of promoter and a role of professional management, right? Corporate governance has to, as you earlier said, all the stakeholders has to be part of that corporate governance framework, right? Now, in your experience, because you have dealt with promoters, you have dealt with many other stakeholders, who is the flag bearer of corporate governance? Can we single out one particular person, in the sense, is it an independent director, a promoter, or a CEO, or a MD? Can we single out someone, or it has to be a collective?
No, I think as far as the promoter companies are concerned, where we talked about 70% of companies being promoter driven, this is not just true in India, it's a global phenomenon, because ultimately companies are set up by promoters. So if you look at global corporations, whether it is in Europe and all that, I think it's largely promoter driven. There are very few companies which I would say is not promoter driven actually. So I think that's born in a minority. And therefore the promoters do play a big role in all of this actually. Ultimately it comes down to, I always used to tell promoters when I was working, is that the value creation comes because there are others who buy your story and invest in your story actually. And I think that's how the value creation and wealth creation happens for promoters actually. And hence I think promoters need to remember that. But having said that, all promoters are not the same. And unfortunately, a few bad apples can actually queer the pitch actually. Now the question is that as a promoter of a company, I think using a good independent board is actually a strength. Now the question is that are companies taking efforts promoters taking efforts to have a good independent board is number one actually. Secondly, the inclusion is very critical, which means is the promoter actually listening to the independent director actually, because ultimately I think it is important to listen to the experience that the independent directors bring, which is all oriented towards helping the company actually. And third, of course, independent directors should also be kind of confident in terms of telling the promoter areas that need to be corrected actually. But this is still a developing area, because I think many independent boards are people who have been appointed by the promoters because of proximity actually, and hence I think sometimes the question is that are they truly independent comes into play. And secondly, I think in many of the promoter companies cases, the promoters do take all the decisions actually, which means that sometimes independent directors can be a rubber stamp, and I think independent directors should guard against it actually. But this is not an easy area for independent directors, because even conversations around it to say that I have a challenge in this company is not easy. There is no forum where independent directors can help voice it. And today the regulatory process around the resignation of an independent director has also become extremely complicated. You know, I think if you are becoming an independent director for a period of 3 years or 5 years, if you resign in between, you have to explain, SEBI looks at it. So I think even resignation is difficult actually. So hence I think we all need to do the sensible thing, but I think we still have some way to go before governance with promoters, independent directors, management, all kind of saying the same thing and doing the right thing happens. I think we are still, it's work in progress, I would say. I think the only good news is that if there are challenges in governance that we have seen in newspapers, these are with a very handful of companies. I think sometimes regulators tend to paint everybody with the same brush. So regulators want to check everything with every single company, irrespective of whether you are a Tata or whether you are a simple promoter actually. And that is where I think the regulators need to probably step back and see how do you refine governance to make it easier to comply, is what I would say.
Thank you so much, Giri. This has been so insightful.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot and look forward for more.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.